Course June 19, 1944. Mid-morning over the Philippine Sea. A gull-gray F6F Hellcat tips its canopy beneath the sun, oil streaks tracing the wing route. In the radio, hiss a calm voice from a carrier's combat information center cuts through. Bogies 270, Angels 25, Vector 310. The pilot checks fuel, 80 gallons, enough for the run and a climb, then shoves the throttle against the stop. Ahead, Orote field on Guam flickers in the distance, a strip of tan carved into green. Zeros are lifting off, wheels not yet tucked, when the first American section drops out of a higher sky. 650s answer with a braided flash. Tracers rake 10's wing, fuel ignites, and the arc finishes in a plume across the runway's threshold. Two more Japanese aircraft try to claw for altitude and are cut off by the second section's diving pass. In less than a minute, the pattern is broken. The American fighters don't stay to turn and dance. They slash, climb, and reset. Behind the guns, ships in Task Force 58 hold a disciplined geometry. Carriers masked inside flak curtains, picket destroyers watching the horizon, radar shadows pasted to plotting boards. Marines are ashore on Saipan, their transports fat targets just over the curve of the ocean. If these Japanese aircraft punch through, the beaches will pay. The Hellcats know their job. Hold the shield, bleed the raid, keep the lodgment alive one vector at a time. The intercept spirals outward. A second gaggle appears inbound for Guam, then a third hustling low from the west. Controllers talk the cap onto the merges like chess. Over Orote, the sky becomes a grid where altitude bands matter more than bravado. By the time the fight drifts seaward, American pilots tally dozens of downed aircraft for one Hellcat lost. Exact verifications will come later. What counts now are the transports still unloading and the empty approach lanes above Saipan. The opening image is simple: a canopy, a voice in the headphones, and a decision to fight on numbers, not nerves. They believed a decisive stroke could reset the war. Operation Ago would pull American carriers into reach of long-range strikes, while land-based air from the Marianas and the Bonins closed jaws around the amphibious force. Japanese doctrine prized will, formation, discipline, and courage honed by seasoned aces. The enemy was supposed to meet them on equal terms and lose heart. But the Marianas fights did not care about intent. What happened instead was the collision of spirit with system. A network of radar sets, fighter direction teams, secure radios, and a rugged, forgiving carrier fighter stacked advantages. The Hellcat did not win by mystical edge. It won by shifting the geometry to climbs and dives, by surviving hits that once killed, and by showing up in numbers because factories and forward depots kept the pipeline full. In June 1944, air war in the Central Pacific became arithmetic conducted at 250 knots. The equations favored America. The timing heightened every stake. The U.S. offensive, Operation Forager, opened Saipan on 15 June 1944, with Tinian and Guam to follow. Seizing these islands would place B-29 Orote airfields within striking distance of the home islands and rip open the Japanese inner perimeter. The amphibious lodgment was fragile during its first days. If Japanese carrier air or land-based groups broke through, troop ships and beachheads could be hammered before the foothold solidified. The 5th Fleet guarded this hinge with a massed carrier screen. 7 Fleet and 8 light carriers, roughly 900 carrier aircraft ready to fly continuous combat air patrols. Across the horizon, Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa's mobile fleet counted 3 fleet and 6 light carriers, roughly 450 carrier aircraft, plus hundreds of land-based planes marshaled under Vice Admiral Kakuji Kakuta. Both commands knew the next 48 hours would decide more than an island chain. Japan's assumptions had an internal logic. The decisive battle tradition envisioned drawing the enemy into range, scoring asymmetric blows, then finishing a shaken fleet with heavy units. In the Marianas, Eigo bet on distance. Launch long-legged strike waves of D-4Y, Judy dive bombers, and B-6N Jill torpedo bombers with A-6M50s escorting, while Guam and Orote fields supplemented with land-based fighters and bombers. The pre-war training model had created elite pilots, 1941-42, men fluent in deflection shooting and formation cohesion. If the Americans could be surprised or forced into turning fights, Zero pilots could claw back initiative. But the war's pressure had eaten the foundation. Fuel shortages and attrition degraded the pilot pipeline by 1943-44. Groups arrived with fewer hours and less formation time than their predecessors. Aircraft quality also lagged. The A-6M remained nimble but fragile and unprotected by armor or self-sealing tanks, while newer types were available in limited numbers. The plan's outer jaw, land-based strength, had already been blunted by U.S. carrier strikes in the lead-up to the landings. What looked sound on paper depended on seasoned hands and airfields that, by mid-June, were losing aircraft on the ground faster than they could replace them. Across the chessboard, the Hellcat represented an opposite design philosophy. Grumman built it for carrier work first. Wide stance gear, tough airframe, an engine that shrugged off salt and abuse. 650 caliber guns gave steady, reliable fire. Self-sealing tanks and cockpit armor increased pilot survival. The airplane forgave mistakes and absorbed punishment that would have killed lighter fighters. It did not need the tightest turn. It needed to climb, dive, and bring its pilot back to the deck cycle intact. By mid-war, the type had already become the central pillar of fleet air defense, accounting for a large majority of Navy aerial victories, with credited kills above 5,100 and an overall kill-to-loss near 19.1, 1943-45, recognizing methodology caveats. Radios and IFF were standardized, VHF nets simplified control, and every carrier practiced gunnery and intercepts that synchronized with CIC fighter direction. Hellcats were also maintenance-friendly. The ships carried spare engines and prop hubs. Armorers knew the gun harmonization like a ritual. Deck crews could turn a cap-bird in minutes. The platform fit a system that prized endurance over flourish. The first contact in this campaign narrative begins over Guam, morning of 19th of June. Long before the famous carrier raids reached striking distance, American radar screens painted takeoffs from Orote as Japanese pilots tried to lift a strike. Fighter direction vectored dozens of F6Fs to intercept the climb-out and the return patterns. The Hellcats arrived into a target-rich funnel. The tactic was rehearsed. Meet them high, dive through the formation, concentrate fire, and refuse to linger where turn performance mattered most. Reports vary, but a conservative summary holds. Over Orote that morning, American fighters shot down roughly 30 Japanese aircraft as they tried to land or form up, with many of the remainder damaged beyond repair. Earlier that morning, an initial clash as aircraft lifted resulted in scores of further losses, while American losses in these opening exchanges were minimal. The key is not raw claims. It is the structure of the fight. Interception at altitude, repeated slashing passes, and a reset that kept energy and initiative. The Guam field was effectively blinded from providing coherent support to Ozawa's carrier raids. By the time the first Japanese carrier strike groups approached Task Force 58 later that morning, they did so without confident land-based top cover and into a sky where Hellcats chose when and how to merge. The turning point unfolded as a chain of raids. Late morning, call it Raid Y, American radar picked up Japanese carrier planes at long range. The fighter direction officers stacked the cap in altitude belts. High cover near 25,000 feet, mid-cover around 18,000, and a lower band at 12,000. each with assigned sectors and handoff protocols. The first intercept met the incoming group still dozens of miles from the task force. In minutes, the formation eroded, with survivors pushing into disorganized VICs that bled energy in level flight. Those who slipped past found only flak corridors and rehearsed ship maneuvers. One bomb struck a battleship without disabling her. It would be the only meaningful hit of the day. Raid 2 came just after 11 UD. The Cap, hot from the first engagement, rearmed and restacked, while other divisions rotated into place. Fighter direction again vectored multiple divisions into the approach lanes, and the exchange grew even more lopsided. Accounts credit roughly 70 of 107 attackers destroyed before reaching ships. Those who arrived found measured anti-aircraft fire layers and were cut down in the terminal run. Raid 3rd, from the north, met 40 fighters at 50 miles and broke apart before committing. Raid 4, split by navigation errors, saw part of its strength stumble onto an American task group, with the remainder falling back on Guam, only to be intercepted over Orote by more Hellcats during landing. Through these cycles, the Americans refused to be dragged into the slow-turning fights that favored zero agility. They attacked from favorable geometry, withdrew, then attacked again. At sea, two submarine names wrote parallel lines into the day's math. USS Albacore punched a torpedo into the new armored carrier Taihō, a design meant to absorb punishment. Poor damage control and fumes turned survivable hurt into catastrophe. Hours later, USS Cavalla found Shōkaku and sent her under with 3 torpedoes while she tried to recover aircraft. Ozawa's air group suddenly lost 2 major decks and their recovery windows. The running air battle now punished more than pilots. It disrupted deck cycles, fuel top-offs, and the timing of follow-on strikes. The mobile fleet's mass shrank with each hour. The day closed with a simple truth. Japanese raids lost aircraft at rates they could not sustain. American losses were modest. Claims from pilots and gunners carried the breathless optimism of combat. But even after audits, the exchange proved punishing. The first day crippled Ozawa's offensive punch, and it did so by means easily described on a plotting board. Altitude gates, multiple intercept opportunities, and a last-ditch wall of flak that included new fuses designed to detonate near targets rather than guess by time. Victories like this are manufactured. The logistics seam behind the Hellcat was thick with ships and spares. Grumman built 12,275 Hellcats overall, with more than 11,000 in roughly 2 years, an output tempo that flattened shortages and allowed generous replacement pools. Forward bases at Majuro and Eniwetok staged engines and propellers. Escort carriers ferried replacement aircraft forward. Combat-damaged birds could be swapped quickly, keeping deck parks ready for dawn. Ammunition and fuel metered the pace. 5-inch shells with fuses staged high for flak, 50-caliber belts loaded by the thousand. Avgas piped into carriers at anchorages that had turned into floating depots. The deck choreography mattered too. Ordnance crews harmonized guns, checked bore sight, and understood how many seconds of fire a sortie had used. There was no romance in this. It was checklists, cranes, and spare parts arriving at the right time. That invisible machinery allowed a Capi to stay thick when it had to be thick. Intelligence and control helped choose the fight. Months before Forager, a Japanese planning document, the so-called Z-Plan, fell into American hands after the loss of Admiral Minichi Koga's plane and a daring submarine pickup, then was translated and disseminated to commanders. It signaled how and where Japan intended to defend the Marianas and what weight to expect from carriers and land-based air. In the battle itself, early warning came from air search radars and radio intelligence. Combat information centers fused SKSC radar traces, bearings, and altitude estimates with a disciplined VHF voice net. Fighter directors issued bogey dope with altitudes, vectors, and intercept points. Ships on the perimeter performed handoffs as raids crossed sectors. The product was simple. Hellcats rarely began at a disadvantage. They were given geometry before they saw silhouettes. The gap that truly mattered was human capital. At the war's start, Japan fielded elite naval aviators with deep hours, often 500-700 flight hours for those entering combat, 1941-42. By 1944, fuel and time shortages, plus crushing attrition, reduced averages to about 300 hours for Navy pilots and 200 for Army pilots, with fewer hours in the exact combat type. Meanwhile, U.S. naval aviators joining carrier squadrons by mid-1944 typically carried 300-plus hours, and they trained under a system that rotated combat veterans into instruction. Sin guns and deflection training normalized the shots Hellcats would take at steep crossing angles. Crucially, crews operated as sections and divisions with standard hand signals and radio brevity enforced by senior pilots and controllers. You can measure the competence gap as wasted seconds in a merge, or as the number of courses a controller can call before a bandit realizes he's been bracketed. In June 1944, those seconds accumulated into outcomes. Doctrine then tied the system to the airframe. U.S. fighter pilots refused the enemy's preferred fight. Turn contests bled energy and handed advantage to lightweight zeros in tight spirals. The cap fought vertical. High side passes, brief firing windows, immediate climb and reset. It used discipline, mutual support in sections and divisions, over individual flourish. The deck group managers, backed by radar controllers, kept altitude stacked so the first intercept hit hard, and a second or third could harvest the leakers. The Hellcat made this doctrine easy. It could dive hard, keep its guns steady, then climb back into radar coverage with fuel to spare. In the Marianas, that doctrine found an opponent still anchored to older habits and stretched by range. There were failures and caveats. Night recovery on June 20th was costly. When Admiral Mark Mitcher ordered a long-range dusk strike, the mission beyond darkness, 226 aircraft pressed an attack at the limit of range, sinking the light carrier Taihō and damaging other ships. Returning pilots found black water and tight fuel margins. Many ditched or crashed attempting night landings despite the unprecedented order to turn on the lights across the task force. The next day, tallies acknowledged dozens of friendly aircraft lost to fuel and darkness, not enemy fire. Japanese air groups, though battered, still put weapons near American ships on the 19th and damaged a battleship. And in skilled hands, late-war Japanese fighters, such as the N-1K, could be dangerous in a fair merge, though they were too few to bend the curve. These realities do not reverse the outcome. They sharpen it. The victory owed to a system that allowed risks like the dusk strike and absorbed the costs. Roll the numbers up, conservatively. Over 2 days, 19th to the 20th of June, American carriers and their screens lost 123 aircraft destroyed and 109 personnel killed, while Japanese losses ranged 550, 645 aircraft destroyed across carrier and land-based groups. 2 fleet carriers, Taihō and Shōkaku, fell on the 19th to submarines. Taihō sank under air attack on the 20th. Oilers also went down. Task Force 58's starting strength counted 7 fleet and 8 light carriers with 900 carrier aircraft. Ozawa's carriers fielded 450, with roughly 300 land-based aircraft in theater. Within those totals, Hellcats did most of the killing. On June 19th alone, U.S. carrier pilots claimed 380 enemy aircraft, with F6Fs credited with the overwhelming share, acknowledging that audited confirmations are fewer. Across the war, 1943-45, Hellcats accumulated 5,163, 5,223 credited kills, and an overall 19.1 kill-to-loss in air-to-air fighting, with all the usual cautions about claim inflation and counting rules. No ratio wins a war by itself, but in the Marianas, the ratio was not a boast. It was a forecast for the next campaign. Psychology bent under the weight of those outcomes. Japanese after-action reflections and later memoirs described shock at radar-vectored interceptions that arrived before formations could organize. Veteran pilots found themselves paired with green wingmen who lost cohesion in the first dive. The sense of being watched, of unseen eyes fixing intercept points, pervaded the air battle. On the American side, the surprise ran in the other direction. Pilots briefed for a desperate fight found raids that broke apart under the first attack and escorts that rarely forced a fair contest. The shock transmitted to the surface. Ozawa's remaining decks became steel without air groups, carriers in name only. Over Saipan, Hellcats could cover more windows for close support, and strike groups took off with fewer worries about enemy cap. The math of dominance shaped behavior as surely as it shaped losses. In the 9 months that followed, the ripples widened. With carriers gutted, Japan struggled to mount carrier-based opposition at Leyte Gulf in October 1944. Surviving carriers were used as decoys, their flight decks largely bare, while land-based air took increasingly desperate roles. The Marianas bases became B-29 springboards, shifting strategic pressure onto the home islands. At sea, the U.S. found that it could drive carrier groups deeper into contested water, with confidence that the air shield would hold. The Marianas therefore mark not only a battlefield victory, but a structural turn. After June 1944, Japan never again assembled a carrier-striking force capable of meaningfully contesting the U.S. at sea. There is an ethical shadow we should admit without drama. Air superiority enabled bombardments and interdictions that affected civilians on Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. The ground battles displaced thousands and took many non-combatant lives. Aircraft losses and carrier sinkings meant air crews and sailors dying far from home. We describe exchange ratios as operational facts, not trophies. The arithmetic is about capability and survival, not value. The historical point remains. System advantage shortens wars, but does not spare suffering. Legacy arrived in doctrine as much as in legend. The Marianas fights made radar fighter direction, integrated CICs, and disciplined voice control the standard for carrier operations. Training floors, measured in hours before deployment, were set with generous margins and reinforced by veteran rotations into schoolhouses. Energy tactics, section integrity, and altitude stacking became the grammar of naval air-to-air combat. The Hellcat's fame rests on this synergy. A tough, reliable machine embedded in a command, control, and logistics web that multiplied its traits. Post-war navies absorbed the lesson. Airframes matter, but systems decide. Return to the opening canopy. The pilot watches the vector card and the horizon seam as Saipan sits over the curve of the Earth. He will not meet an equal opponent at equal terms, not if the system keeps its promises. The verdict is spare and unsentimental. In the Marianas, America chose when to fight and how to fight. The Hellcat made that choice stick. The numbers were the story. Altitudes, gallons, seconds to intercept. And the story bent the war's arc. The sky kept the score. The beaches lived to see another dawn.